Hi, everyone. So great to see so many people here. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to what promises to be a rigorous and timely conversation about an episode that has suddenly thrust the politics of the Western Hemisphere onto global headlines: the recent U.S. operation to detain President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela and thereby gain control of the world's largest proven oil reserves. The ultimate rationale for this intervention has been a shifting one, but one consistent theme coming out of Washington has been an insistence on something called energy security. Our world is one in which the word security is tacked onto anything requiring justification for force, diplomatic pressure, and economic levers to reshape the political landscape. But today we plan to go deeper. What does this idea of energy security really mean? Is it really a genuine driver of the Venezuelan intervention, or is it rather a rhetorical shortcut on the part of the Trump administration for broader geopolitical aims? Sensing the urgency of this moment, I convene the leaders of Dartmouth's Irving Institute for Energy and Society, Jeff Parker, who you just heard from, as well as Daryl Press, who is the director of the Davidson Institute for Global Security. I called them last week. I said, let's get together. Let's see what we can come up with our local expertise, and hopefully some people will show up. And I'm very pleasantly surprised to see how many of you are interested in this topic. We were inspired to come together quickly for what we hope will be the first of many discussions around energy and security in the contemporary geopolitical landscape. And I think there's kind of a horrible joke going around right now that this panel is about Venezuela. The next one will likely be about Greenland. We are fortunate to have colleagues from across campus with regional knowledge and expertise who were able to pivot quickly to join us when we first started talking about this idea literally 7 days ago. Looking ahead, we plan to bring Venezuelan voices to campus, as Jeff said, to help deepen our understanding not only of that region, but also its implications for energy and the general landscape of economic, cultural, and historical contingencies arising out of our relationship with our southern neighbor. We hope you'll continue to join us over the next few months as we bring a truly interdisciplinary lens to these issues. And with that, I'm going to introduce our 4 speakers, and I'll go through them each and then invite each one up to speak for a few minutes on their thoughts on the issue of energy security in Venezuela. And then we'll have a moderated conversation with a chance for you to ask some questions as well. First, we have Daryl Press, professor of government, and as I said, the faculty director of the Davidson Institute for Global Security. Professor Press's research and teaching focus on U.S. foreign policy, deterrence, and the future of warfare. He's published 2 books, Calculating Credibility and The Myth of the Nuclear Revolution, and his work has appeared in leading academic journals such as International Security, the American Political Science Review, and Security Studies, as well as in the popular press. Professor Press is the co-founder of the Strategic Forces Boot Camp in partnership with Sandia National Laboratories, and he is our inaugural director of the Davidson Institute for Global Security at Dartmouth. He consults regularly for the U.S. Defense Department and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Professor Klaus-Dieter Barbknecht is our Harris Distinguished Visiting Professor at Dartmouth. The Harris Professorship at Dartmouth is an extremely prestigious professorship that brings scholars and leaders from German institutions to Dartmouth. It's a long-standing relationship we have with German institutions, and we are honored to have Professor Barbknecht with us here. He is just stepping down, I think, as the rector, or do you still have some more time as rector of TÜBAF?
No.
You're step down. Okay. So he was the rector, president of the Technische Universität Bergakademie Freiburg, TUBOF, we call it, from 2015 to this past year. He's a distinguished academic, economist, and lawyer. His expertise lies primarily in the fields of energy law and labor law. As rector of TUBOF, his landmarks include a progressive internationalization of the university, its continuing increase in third-party funding, and pronounced transfer activities, which have led to 80 spin-offs within his 10 years appointment as rector. Klaus-Dieter Barbnecht has held various management and board positions and has been an officer and vice chair for strategic leadership communities at the World Energy Council. Next, we have Bill Davis, who's on the screen with us. Hi, Bill. Global Energy Executive. Bill is a graduate of Dartmouth College, Stanford University, and Cornell University, from which he holds an MBA. As an energy leader, Davis brings a lifelong passion for energy and extensive global experience to the forefront of the evolving energy landscape. He worked for over 25 years for ExxonMobil, developing upstream partnerships, activating major projects, and running energy businesses on 5 continents. As lead country manager for India with Exxon, he led a transformative period of collaboration on energy solutions for a rapidly growing nation. In previous roles, he launched the $10 billion Golden Pass LNG export project in Texas, struck landmark natural gas deals in Australia, and navigated turbulent times as South America gas manager based in Buenos Aires. Davis began his career exploring South America as a geologist for mining giant Rio Tinto. And last we have Peter DeShazo, who is a visiting professor this year at Dickey and in the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies program. Peter DeShazo is an ambassador and a Dartmouth class of '69. He is also the chair of the Globalization Studies concentration in the Master of Arts in Liberal Studies program at Dartmouth College. As a career U.S. Foreign Service officer, Ambassador DeShazo was posted in Latin America and the Middle East, including in Caracas, Venezuela, and served as Deputy U.S. Permanent Representative at the Organization of American States and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemispheric Affairs. After retiring from the State Department, Ambassador DeShazo directed the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and was executive director of LASPOW, Academic Programs for the Americas, affiliated with Harvard University. He has taught at the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins, at Harvard, and at Boston University. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists.
Thank you guys for coming. As Barbara said, I'm Daryl Press. I teach in the government department here. I was given 8 minutes and the very simple task of explaining the goals, objectives, and logic of the Trump administration's strategy toward Venezuela and Latin America, the region. So that should be quite simple. Let me simply kick off by saying, in my opinion, the Trump administration is particularly challenging for those of us outside of the administration to understand for a variety of reasons that we could talk about in Q&A. But nevertheless, the core structure of the administration is like that of all U.S. administrations. You have a president on the top with his own views and his own instincts about how politics works, who is the ultimate decider. But then you also have a whole coterie of senior policymakers who work for the president, but who bring to their jobs their own viewpoints, their own versions of the ideology, and their own organizational interests. And the result is that in this administration, like all others, policy ends up being an amalgam of many different voices, many different perspectives, et cetera. My approach to trying to do what I was asked to do, therefore, is to try to understand what I would call the currents of thought, meaning what are the streams of ideas and the streams of beliefs that seem to animate the key members of the administration? And how does understanding those help us understand what the administration as an organization is up to toward Venezuela and toward the region? And that's what I'll try to do in my 6.5 remaining minutes or so. Okay. I'm going to do that by just introducing you to three concepts. These are concepts you've heard before, but let me put them in the context of what we've seen in the news. Concept number one, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine has been the foundation of U.S. strategic thought throughout U.S. history. What does the Monroe Doctrine and maybe the Roosevelt Corollary say? It says or implies that the United States is going to have substantial influence over the politics and the choices of the other countries in the Western Hemisphere. And it says that that influence is going to be largely exclusive, meaning that the United States is going to try to prevent foreign actors, actors from outside the region, from doing what we would consider intervention in the core political and security affairs in the region. Now, you might hear that and say, that sounds rather unfair, and that the other countries in the region are, after all, sovereign countries. And my response would be yes and yes, but it's hard for me to convey how central this idea as the foundation of American strategies has been throughout our history and to this day. And let me say that by simply giving you two alternative illustrations. Think about Russia's strategic situation. Russian planners are always thinking about what the problem of the day is, but they're also thinking about the consequences of their long and largely unguarded border in the southeast with China, as well as their long border in the west with some coalition of Western countries, including the United States. Think about China's strategic situation. China has a variety of political and strategic goals in its region, and it feels strongly constrained by the U.S. military alliance network throughout maritime East Asia, principally the U.S. alliance with Japan, the U.S. alliance with South Korea, and with Australia, which give the United States the ability, if we choose, to intervene in a variety of things that the Chinese would wish we didn't. If you compare that to the United States is completely freed from an equivalent set of concerns. And all of its foreign policy activities, U.S. foreign policy activities around the world, are premised on the understanding that there are no powerful foes and there are no foreign powers who are exerting significant power in what we, not very humbly, consider our strategic backyard. So concept one is Monroe Doctrine. Concept number two, the rise of China. The rise of China has activated, or perhaps you should think of it as energized, the Monroe Doctrine thinking. Think back in the Cold War, when the United States was involved in what it considered to be a pretty intense geopolitical rivalry. The Monroe Doctrine was alive and well, even though it was considered impolite to talk about it openly. Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was about preventing the Soviet Union from putting dangerous weapons in the Western Hemisphere. Think about the various governments in Latin America and South America that the United States toppled because they were left-leaning. Think about the proxy wars that the United States fought against pro-communist or pro-Soviet guerrillas. This was all about trying to preserve this US sanctuary in the Western Hemisphere. But then we went into the post-Cold War world, in which the United States was at a maximal position of power, a minimal position of threat, and worrying about what was happening in the Western Hemisphere waned. Well, the problem, from the standpoint of our Western Hemisphere neighbors, is that rivalry is back. Geopolitics is back. China is building political and economic power in general, and China is building political and economic ties with countries across South and Central America. Major investments in infrastructure programs, major investments in energy, major investments in things like telecom. And the consequence of this has been renewed US focus on influence and regional exclusivity in the Western Hemisphere. And I hate to say it, but my prediction is that that attitude of the United States will survive this current administration, and it will be said differently, and it will be argued differently, but it will be a powerful role in American foreign policy in future Democrat or Republican administrations to come. The very last thing, and I'll spend only 1 minute on this, is of course the one which we'll spend a lot of time on this panel on, is oil. And I'll simply say, oil plays a key role in geopolitics because it still powers economies and because it still powers military forces. In peacetime, it doesn't matter where you get your oil from. A barrel of oil is roughly equivalent to a barrel of oil. But over and over again, you get crises around the world where having influence over major producers and influencing them to significantly increase production has been very beneficial to the United States and to other actors around the world. I'll also note that being able to influence critical swing producers to increase production to affect oil prices and lead-ups to elections has been very impactful. All right, in conclusion, I think we have a few different tasks here. One of them is to understand the policy. One of them is to evaluate. One of them is to judge. But my job in this was not to do all three of these. My job is to help fill in the first one. And I would say the first step is trying to understand to what extent this is a continuation of policy, to what extent it's a big departure, and ultimately, what were the sorts of strategic rationales that were feeding into this complicated decision processing that led to a reorientation of US policy toward the Western Hemisphere. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Daryl, because you makes it a bit easier for me to say, as a foreigner, it's much more harder to understand the politics of US. But I don't have to judge this and I don't have to comment this. I only want to speak about the oil issue and the oil in Venezuela issue and energy security as a topic of not only US but all over the world. As you already said, the fossil fuels are still 75 to 80%. It depends on in which country we are. Basis for the energy supply in each of the countries. Yeah. Despite of all the renewables and despite of nuclear and so on, oil and gas and coal are the main drivers of the economies worldwide. And therefore, energy security always was and is a very, very important factor for all countries and especially for the highly industrialized countries like US and like Europe, whereby quite a few of them do not possess any significant energy reserves of their own. This especially counts for Europe. And some players have lost sight of the enormous importance of security of supply and their belief in a total global market. We see it especially in Europe. The belief in everything is borderless and everything is a total open market, especially to China and other countries, led to the situation that the security of supply for oil and gas in Europe shrinked. And that is a problem we have. If you talk about energy security, we have to take into account the overall global situation in the past, in the current situation, and in future scenarios. We know the past, even if there might be different views on the reasons why things developed as they happened. We don't know the future. This sounds like a platitude, but has been often enough forgotten. In the past, we had several crises and events which influenced not only oil and gas prices, but also the global demand for fossil fuels. May I remind you briefly, the first and second oil crisis in the 70s of last century as a reaction from OPEC against the Western Hemisphere on war situations was Israel against the neighbors. The price peaks going along with Iraq aggression against other countries in the region, and more recently, the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. This all influenced prices on the fuel fossil markets. But we also saw a decrease in demand in the last 20 years. For example, during and after the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, so in 2009, 2010, it was a decrease of overall consumption of oil and gas in the world. Or during COVID-19 pandemic, this was also a reason why the demand decreased in those times. Nowadays, or in the last 10 years, the demand is more or less stable, and if we look in the future, which we can only do via scenarios, we see that most of the analysts say we have an increase or growth of demand on oil and gas by 5 to 10% for the next 10 years. It's not too much. Most of those disruptive events were not predictable, and neither the countries nor the economy in those countries were prepared to react on rise and fall of fuel prices. But especially in the US, we recognized an overall strategy of several administrations to limit the import dependency for oil and gas since the 1970s. As you already said, it's not relevant whether it was a Democratic or Republican government. They all had the same issue: save the security of supply for oil and gas. Different instruments, but at the end, it was the overall policy. So starting with the export prohibition in the 70s, and followed by supporting an increase of indigenous production under all administrations since Bush Sr. Not only shale oil and gas, but also other new on- and offshore licenses had big impact on the market and led to a change in the role of US from a net importer of oil to a net exporter, not only with oil, but actually also with gas, natural gas. The export prohibition was canceled under Obama administration. It's not so long here since then. And as a matter of fact, US paid the independency and security of supply with higher crude oil prices since around 2010. If you look at the price situation since 2010, it was a stable level around $80 per barrel to 110 in the peak, but if you drew a line through the price development, it's around $80, $70 to $80. And this did not avoid price peaks in 2022 and other years due to lack of availability of oil and gas from Russia. But this was normal market behavior. It was not a question of security of supply. It was normal market behavior. And in my opinion, it was also a test to the market how much consumers will pay before they start to reduce consumption. The massive destruction of production capacity in Iraq and the severe sanctions against Iran and Russia had certainly an effect on prices for crude oil in the US and Europe. But at the end, security of supply was never again in real problems since the OPEC shock in the 1970s, especially for US. Especially the shale production in US, which is very flexible and reacts on price issues very soon, is a heavy factor in the US market and in the discussion about security of supply. Whereas existing shale oil production can produce oil on a price level around 40 to 45 US dollar per barrel in this region, the development of new infrastructure and drilling increases the production price to a level of 65 to 70 US dollar per barrel. Still, cost level which is feasible to invest at the current prices. This is around, but it's around 5 to 7 times more than production in Saudi Arabia, and approximately double and triple compared to production in Canada and Russia. But it's not a question, and I think we will hear about it more from him, it's not a question of security of supply or the feasibility of the production, it's more a question of the expectations in the profit. If we look at the data we have available for US, the proven reserves of the US oil is on a peak production and consumption good for the next 9.5 to 10 years. Coming to the Venezuela issue. This country is clearly bankrupt, and the infrastructure, I think that is the ambassador who can talk much better about this, is at all rotten down. The infrastructure is not only the infrastructure for the energy, but also the streets and the shops and whatever you see in Venezuela, it's rotten down. Venezuela's oil production peaked just before Hugo Chavez took office in 1999 and has since declined sharply, dropping from around 3.1 million barrels per day in 1998 to about 860 in 2024, and in 2025 it even dropped more down to around 500. So the question is, despite of the fact that Venezuela has a huge reserves, the biggest one in the world, just after this is Saudi Arabia, it's a question, is to invest in Venezuela a short-term, middle-term, or long-term investment in security of supply? In my opinion, it's not a short-term issue. It's more a long-term issue to invest in the Venezuelan oil and gas oil production, because the investment is around, if we believe in the figures most of the analysts say, around 160 to 180 billion dollars. So this is a huge amount, and if we put this on the price level for the oil, we have more or less the same range as we have for new production of shale oil in US. And then is the question where we put the money in. I think that is good to discuss. Thank you for the time, Marx.
Can you hear me?
Hey, Bill. Yeah, thanks for joining us. You're up next.
Okay, super. Shall I roll? Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And it's always great to do anything at Dartmouth or even virtually. And this whole topic is especially interesting for me because I started my energy career working on a project in Venezuela. Of course, things turned south. And over the course of the next couple decades and a bit, there was one lingering question, and that was, when is Venezuela going to come back into the picture again? And lo and behold, it's now. But the real question is, where is Venezuelan energy headed? And to answer that, you've got to come to grip with some realities here. And that is that reactivating the energy sector in Venezuela faces a lot of major challenges. And though, as Klaus Dieter mentioned, it's got the world's largest oil reserves, the industry's been on decline for decades now. And it's producing about a third of its prior peak. Now suddenly the industry's being invited to come back into the country again. And I think overall that potential, the amount of resources there in country is so big that companies are going to look at it. They're going to look seriously and constructively at seeing whether it is an opportunity for them. But of course, we've got history in the region and around the world. The long-term nature of the business, investors are going to be cautious and measure twice before they go in such a fluid situation. So the question really is this an opportunity or an exposure for international oil firms to come in? They don't know yet. What they do know is that any transformation is not likely to happen overnight. Getting production back up to the levels that Venezuela is capable of is going to take time, massive capital investments, as was mentioned before, and really some dramatic improvements in investor terms and security. And that is going to take an effort of all stakeholders, the governments, the companies, the people of Venezuela to make happen. So as a recent alumnus of the energy business, I can now share some perspective on how international energy companies might look at the situation and give you some insight into their mindset. And as we know, these companies are looking at business opportunities. They're required to think about their shareholders. They're required to think about the long game here, informed by history. They're going to look at three elements. They're going to look at the resource that's in country. They're going to look at the investment environment, and they're going to look at security for their people and for their assets over time. There are other factors as well, but these are the ones that are going to come to the top right now. When they look at the resource, they're going to look at what's there in the ground and what it would take to bring it to production. They'll be looking at the legal and fiscal frameworks and pathways towards commercially competitive terms in country. That includes this political foundation. Venezuela is not likely to change overnight. How does that evolve such that we get to a future state where both the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan people are inviting and are looking for foreign interests to come in and be part of their future? And then security. This will require people on the ground helping to develop Venezuela's resources, and that has to be secure as well as those investments. So let's go through each one of these in a little more detail to help understand the analysis that's going into it. So when we look at the resource, the prize there, how much energy is there? We've got over 300 billion barrels of oil, the largest proven reserves of any country on the planet. That's a lot of oil. It is, however, predominantly heavy oil. And heavy oil is thicker, it's harder to handle and refine, and it certainly is, it sells for a lower price ultimately than lighter crudes, and it's much more costly to produce. So Venezuela has a lot of energy, but each barrel in and of itself may be less valuable than competing supplies around the world, and that's going to affect that economic equation and remains to be seen. The next thing is the companies are going to look at what does it take to bring Venezuela back on stream. And we know that the existing production and pipeline and refining infrastructure has been in decline for decades. And it's dilapidated. You've got infrastructure that hasn't been maintained. A lot of capital investments need to continue to be made in this business. And it just hasn't happened. The government hasn't had both the money and the will to have that happen. And you've had the effects of corruption over time. What we can see is that production figures are about a third of what they were at peak. And that tells you that, things are in a certain state. But no one knows exactly what it's like right now. So these companies are going to have to go in and have a look for themselves and assess what is the state of the industry today, many of them having walked away decades ago. That as it may be, you could see this evolving in kind of two stages of revitalization of the industry. The first one would be around enhancing production around the existing fields and infrastructure. Some estimates are that maybe 500,000 barrels a day, up to 1 million barrels a day could be brought on with extra effort over the next 1.5 and 2 years. Companies that already have a footprint, like Chevron and Eni and others, may have the inside track in seeing ways to optimize their current interests in country and identifying some nearer term opportunities to move production up. But the larger work to bring Venezuela back, adding 1-2 million barrels a day of additional production, that's a long-term major endeavor. The estimates are all over the map right now because people haven't had a chance to really come to grips with it, but clearly potential to be over $100 billion and sustained. This is production and efforts that have to go on, decades ultimately. Let's look at the investment environment. So we've talked about what's under the ground. Now we'll talk about, hey, what are the terms for someone to come in and invest? And things are going to have to move into a competitive zone. They're not there right now. Venezuela has not been set up to host international companies in a big way for a long time. They're going to be looking at, what are the terms to get and to develop and produce oil and gas? How are the tax and royalty or production sharing regime structured? And how do those compare with international competing alternatives? And that's one of the things I want to drive home. These companies are going to say, hey, I have to look at all these other options that I have. I could put more money into the Permian. I could do this deep water thing here. Venezuela has to compete with that. And those terms need to be structured such that it takes into account the risk reward that's required for that. The hydrocarbon law would need to be changed as well. Right now you have the state-owned agency, PDVSA, required to have a majority interest in any joint venture. That's a challenge. One, because PDVSA doesn't have the capital access, nor does it perhaps have the technical capability at this stage in the game to take this on. And foreign interest would be more inclined to have a bigger participation in these ventures if they're going to get into them. And then there's the idea of rule of law, and this is really behind everything. The caution is going to come. Being expropriated twice or nationalized twice, which has happened in multiple places around the world, leaves a bad investor taste. And that challenge is, can you see a Venezuela evolving to be a place where those protections are there? Many of these companies actually arbitrated against Venezuela under bilateral investment treaties. It's an arduous process, takes many years to do, and then had trouble collecting the money ultimately. So even when those protections were there, they only got you part way. Now Venezuela has stepped away from many of these treaties and other protections, so we're kind of at a place where things would have to be looked at and changed dramatically. And then the last one, which is very real for looking at what could you do to bring Venezuela to a new peak, would be, how is the security situation on the ground? Obviously, Venezuelans need to welcome companies to come in. The company's people have to be safe and those assets have to be safe. Not just an initial go and have a look, but for tens of years coming. So how do you move towards that situation? Now, so those are kind of the headline things that these companies will be looking at. There's a number of enablers. People will ask about, so how do we get, that sounds really like a big challenge. How do we get the show rolling? What could be done? What something must be able to be done? Well, obviously, a lot of that depends on Venezuela and how Venezuela, both political and the people, evolve over this next stage. But also, if you were to ask the U.S. government, what could the U.S. do? Well, there's a couple things top of list. Obviously, sanctions are in effect for Venezuela, so that by definition, limits the ability to invest in the energy business. And we've seen sanctions kind of come on and off, and companies will be looking for stability, to know that if they come in, sanctions are not going to limit their hand in the future after you've already put $5 billion into the ground and then find out, oh, sorry, now you have to leave. Some sort of assurance that that's not in the cards. Also, the U.S. has ways to bring some financial backing or help through import-export banks, the potential for loan guarantees or other guarantees and revenue management through the U.S. system, which is not easily done today, could bring additional, lighten some of the risks associated with doing this. And then lastly, the part about security, I think the U.S. would probably in the initial stage have something to do with enhancing security, so the initial efforts in country could be smooth and move us in the right direction.
Thank you, Bill. We'll move now to Peter.
Good? Okay. Well, hi, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the political situation in Venezuela now, the security situation, the U.S. role in Venezuela, what it might look like. Talk a little bit about Venezuela's neighbors and how the U.S. relationship with Venezuela will affect other key countries in Latin America. First of all, the regime, the Chavista regime is still in place. The president, acting president or whatever, President Maduro has been removed. His vice president has been sworn in as president of Venezuela. Basically, it's the same regime with a different leader. And there are so many questions involving what this regime is going to look like over time. The regime has different factions. There are very hardcore factions that are very close to the Venezuelan army, the Venezuelan military, which is a key power structure in Venezuela, the Venezuelan security apparatus. The question is how coherent, how firm is this regime going to be in the future? The United States has said that it will control Venezuela's oil sector, that it will control the commercialization of Venezuelan oil, and will use the proceeds of the sale of Venezuelan oil for the good of the American people and the people of Venezuela at its discretion. All of this is quite unclear. Venezuela is utterly dependent on revenue from oil, but at the same time, the United States has this important leverage, but the regime is still in power. It still has control over its national territory. It still has control over key institutions. So it remains to be seen how the United States is going to somehow manage this oil sector, how it's going to use the profits from this oil sector, how the Venezuelan regime will survive without or with what kind of resources it's going to receive, how it's going to receive those resources, how they're going to be spent, what limitations. All of that is unclear, but essential for the future of Venezuela going forward. There are many other issues. Venezuela's relationships with China, Russia, Iran. The United States will certainly put pressure on Venezuela regarding those key relationships. Its relationship with Cuba is another issue that the United States is looking to exploit, certainly to drive a wedge between Cuba and Venezuela. There are other countries in the region that will be affected by the United States' new relationship with Venezuela. I would expect that the change in the nature of the administration and the relationship with the U.S. will affect Venezuela's hitherto pressure on Guyana, which will probably dissipate or will not resurface. This, in turn, means probably greater security for Guyana and will give further impetus to the important oil play, the Stabroek Field and other important oil plays in Guyana will give more confidence to international investors in that area. Colombia is a country that is tightly linked to Venezuela. Of course, they share a border, a very conflictive one, where illegal armed groups pass back and forth across the border, insurgent groups, drug trafficking groups, criminal groups. Control of that border is extremely important. There are also important oil resources along the border, and the border is a major producer of coca, which of course is the precursor, is the material, the raw material for cocaine. Colombia will come under increasing U.S. pressure. Right now, it's producing coca and cocaine at historically high levels. There will be elections in Colombia in May. The United States will look, I'm sure, to have a more productive relationship with the new government in Colombia. Right now, the U.S.-Colombia relationship is probably at record lows. But Colombia is enormously important to the United States as a key ally in the region. The ability of the United States to work closely with Colombia to combat not just the drug trafficking, but also the effect that drug trafficking, criminal gangs, insurgents have on Colombia, to support Colombian efforts to control its national territory, and to be able to guarantee the security of its citizens, to respect the rule of law, to improve the human rights situation in Colombia. All of this should be a key U.S. objective. The big question will be, will the United States come across with the kind of support that in the past we have to ensure that Colombia remains a key ally in the region? As I said earlier, the United States will almost certainly seek to divide Cuba from Venezuela. For years, Cuba's survival, its economic survival, was in part due to a very generous allotment up to about 100,000 barrels a day of oil on very favorable terms from the Chavez administration in the 2000s. This supply has since dwindled to 20, 30,000 barrels a day under Maduro and has basically stopped. Cuba is in the worst economic shape it's been in, perhaps in its entire history, worse even than in the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union. Its electrical grid that runs on diesel, on oil, is in shambles. Right now, Mexico is the largest purveyor of oil to Colombia, but at very low amounts. So Venezuela and the Cuban relationship, if that is severed, is going to be a severe blow to Cuba. Overall, what U.S. policy in Cuba will be is yet to be fully fleshed out, but I assume and would predict that it will be more pressure on the Cuban government, probably towards pressure towards regime change. Finally, the big player for the United States in the region is Mexico. The United States, President Trump has said on different occasions that he would be willing to use military force against drug gangs, drug trafficking in Mexico and in Colombia. The U.S. relationship with Mexico is absolutely essential to the economy of the United States, and it's extremely important for U.S. security and for many other reasons. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, USMCA, will be revisited in the coming months. By June 1st, there's supposed to be an updated version of it, July 1st, excuse me. This is really key. The United States has such an enormous stake in the North American partnership with Canada and Mexico, not just for trade, but for so many other variables, that the renegotiation of this key agreement will be a really central fact. So we have to look very carefully at what the U.S. relationship with Mexico is going to be. One would look towards a relationship of tremendous cooperation. There are so many variables that affect both countries that need to be addressed. Overall, the Trump policy towards Latin America, as outlined in the 2025 National Security Doctrine, is basically a formula for much more unilateral action, militarized action, especially in the area of combating drug trafficking and organized crime. How that plays out in the rest of the region is really important, and the relationship that China has to other countries in the region, where China is the key trade partner of a number of important countries in Latin America, and where Latin America has derived important benefits from its trade with China and from its relationship with China. All of this is going to be revisited. So there's a great deal to be yet known in the coming weeks and months, starting with the situation in Venezuela, but going well beyond that throughout the hemisphere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of our panelists. So now we're going to have a few general questions to discuss between the four of us, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. So I'd like to start with a reference to a couple of things that you said, that you all talked about, which was the sort of the long-term nature of this intervention. So in some ways, what we're getting into may not really be realized, or the security that we're hoping for may not be a immediate effect of this intervention. So, but I'd like to ask actually something about the short term. And this is both a political question and an energy question. So what are the most plausible short-term political scenarios that could emerge over the next 12 months in this situation? And how could each of these scenarios, whether we're talking about regime collapse or hopefully stability or some kind of power share between the US and the Venezuelan governments, how could each of these potential scenarios affect US energy interests in the region? So I'd ask you four to jump into that question any way you want, either to talk about the short-term political prospects we see or the short-term energy prospects we see. Anybody want to start?
I'll start by in a way just flipping around the question. I would say, you know, we're all focused on kind of short-term changes, and we're all focused on short-term successes and failures, and I understand that as well. But I would say that I think if what we should be if we're trying to evaluate this, again, remember, I didn't talk anything about international law. I didn't say anything about what's right or wrong, and those are important questions to ask as well. It wasn't my focus. From the standpoint of U.S. interests, and consistent with what I think the other panelists say, is I would probably assess the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of this direction from the standpoint of U.S. interests by maybe three things that kind of all have to be assessed, I think, in the medium to long term. And so the three things are, what is the reaction across the region? Does this push countries more toward countries like China and countries to get support and protection from greater U.S. bullying? Or, as the administration hopes, does it make countries in this region more concerned and more wary about partnering economically, politically, or even in terms of arms sales with countries out of the region? The second thing is, and I think Peter raised this, is what is the effect of this on the survival and the strength of the other regimes in the region with whom the United States has very difficult relations, most specifically Cuba? And we might find that the Cuban regime is the ultimate survivor, and 20 years later, misery and deprivation notwithstanding, they're just as strong, or it might be that within 6 months, we have an overthrow of the regime, and I think that will matter. And then the last thing is the one that Mr. Davis and Klaus raised, which is, despite all these headwinds, the huge headwinds to investment, the difficulties of bringing heavy oil to market in a time of not such high oil prices, does this result in a situation in a few years with significantly greater global production, and maybe even some spare capacity and some swing state production, which would be beneficial to the United States from the standpoint of national security, if not from the standpoint of our climate goals? And so, to me, all those things are going to have to be, unfortunately, assessed in the medium to long term, rather than something we'll know in 2 weeks.
Yeah. I also would say in the next 12 months, nothing happened. So the first thing is, okay, the very heavy oil we have there is a problem which could be solved a bit through the refineries at the US south border. So we have some, David, please correct me, but we have some refineries there in the region which could at least start to develop those things and to bring this to the market. But the second thing is, even if we talk about the very short-term development up to a daily production of 1 million it's around 10 to 20 billion dollar investment which is needed to do this, and that is very, very difficult. Even if we would say we have a scenario where we have a total change in the government in Venezuela. Venezuela, as far as I remember, has a lot of loans from China and Russia, which they have to pay back. They have a totally rotten infrastructure, as I already said. They need high investments into the country's health and social security system. They need to increase the prices for petrol and so on for the people itself. And because of the fact that the country is more or less bankrupt, you need such a lot of money to go further in the same direction. Even if we would have a very good government, this government will not have any chance to change things without any money from the oil. So the production of oil and the former processing of the oil and then go to the market and so on will be heavily taxed in the beginning. Otherwise, the state hasn't enough money to serve the own country and to serve the loans and so on and so on. So that is very, very difficult. Therefore, I would say it's more midterm, talking about 10 years, and realistic, more 20 years term to change really things in this country. Otherwise, we would really dream instead of talking about reality.
The success of the Maduro regime through enormous economic crisis, through an outflow of a quarter of the Venezuelan population because of that crisis, through all the sanctions the United States had imposed, it basically had been to maintain itself in power. And the key secret in the future will be for the new regime to try to find a point of accommodation with the Trump administration by which it is allowed to maintain itself in power, allowed to govern Venezuela, which for Venezuelans is bad news because of the repressive nature of that regime and its security apparatus, to somehow stay alive with funding through the oil sector, to provide, to take steps perhaps that the United States insists on, but to maintain itself in power over time. How long that relationship can continue, who knows? There are elements within the regime that are extremely nationalistic, will chafe at the undermining of Venezuelan sovereignty in a relationship like this. They are, as big nationalists, it's hard to be in a situation of dependency like that, or being so strongly influenced by a country, especially the United States. And then there's the issue of whether or not there will be any transition to democracy in Venezuela. The Democratic opposition won the 2024 election. They have legitimacy in the eyes of many people around the world, legitimacy that the Madurista, Chavista regime doesn't have, and yet they're basically out of the conversation for now. So this is another issue that's extremely important. But I would guess that the Venezuelan regime is going to try to be flexible and maintain itself in power above all else. The army, the apparatus around Delcy Rodriguez, especially the really hardcore elements, want to remain in power. They have a big stake in staying in power. Some of them have been indicted in the United States. They want to remain in power.
Bill, any thoughts about short-term outcomes? You're muted, I think. Maybe.
Obviously, you have the potential for volatility as you see, energy supplies being directed by the U.S. in the short term. That can move traders into the mix, change some of the economics. We hear that some of those sales have been at a higher price point than it's achievable by Venezuela itself, which increases potential revenues, but where they go, as has been mentioned before, is still a question. I think really, in the short term, you're going to be looking at, will current production continue? Will there be sufficient, in the cycle of money and stuff, to continue to operate those fields, to continue to export? Will there be enabling environments for energy production to continue at the current rate? At the same time, back to the bigger question we were addressing when I talked earlier, we're talking about those investment signals and all the radars from all the companies up. Is Venezuela heading to a place where the current government is compliant, is stable, is perhaps enabling a pathway, or is it resisting it in some way? Or if there's some other more dramatic change of events, you'd expect them to pull back for a little while and see where the dust settles. So I think, like everybody, we're going through a bit of a storm cloud right now, where you could see a bunch of different outcomes, but you don't know which one is coming.
Perfect metaphor, storm cloud. I think we're all feeling that right now.
Okay.
One more question, and then a quick lightning round question. So my second question is, do you see this incident with Venezuela as an isolated operation, or as the opening move of a broader U.S. hemispheric doctrine centered on energy security? So asking you to speculate a little bit here, but be curious to know whether you think this is just a isolated thing or something that's the first of several moves in the hemisphere around energy security.
As a foreigner, it's very difficult to answer this question, but as far as I observed the whole policy in the last 10 to 20 years, I would say it's not the first step. It's not an isolated first step. It's some kind of a different kind of steps, more military driven and so on. But the overall discussion we had in the last 20, 25 years was always security of supply. And as I mentioned in my presentation, I said, since the 1970s, US did a lot to increase security of supply by indigenous production. And this was very important. Now the next step. And if you look at the overall situation, US is linked to South America as Europe to Russia and China to Russia. We have to find a solution for these situations. Otherwise, we'll have a permanent conflict at this border, and this is not healthy for both of the parts of the continent.
I'd say I think there's very little about this that's a one-off. I think it's a big theme of American foreign policy all around the world to have close ties to major energy producers, and you see it obviously in spades in the Persian Gulf region. I think, in my opinion, my guess is the continuation of the policy in the region might not be as focused on energy. Energy will be important in terms of the fallout with respect to Venezuela. The key continuation of the policy in the region is the next step of, I think, what I described, which is efforts to coerce those in the region who are adversarial toward the United States, and efforts to coerce the folks who the United States sees on the fence to be less welcoming to investments and cooperation and political ties to non-Western Hemisphere actors. So I think that's the direction this is going to go. And I do suspect it will continue even if there's a Democratic administration. The words will be different. The communication strategy will be different. The smiles will be bigger. But I think from the standpoint of our southern neighbors, they will see this as more or less a continuation, and they will feel more of this going forward. It's my guess.
Certainly a return to unilateralism in the region. In terms of energy, Venezuela is one case, but the other big oil producers, Brazil, Guyana, Colombia, Mexico, in the region, they're all integrated into world markets. I think the United States will use military pressure in other circumstances in the region, our willingness to put it on the table. One thing leads to another, but the past focus on more multilateral cooperation, on promulgation of democracy in the hemisphere, these clearly are taking very much of a backseat.
Anything to add, Bill? About
Yeah, I think much of that was well covered. I do see probably a disposition to kind of defend a U.S. energy interests in the region, but maybe not. Certainly not the only thing going on. And as Daryl mentioned, really, there's probably a bigger push there that's broader than just an energy one. Venezuela is an important one, but in and of itself doesn't, it's just part of a big market. Right now, it's like less than 1% of the world energy market. So that could change, but it's probably early days before you could see a pattern where energy's come to the top and is driving all this.
Super, thank you so much. Final question, quick lightning question. One sentence answer is fine. If you could give the US president one piece of advice about the Venezuelan situation today, what would it be? Daryl?
This was my mistake by choosing this chair, is that I always have to go first, other people can think. I guess, and I don't know if this is already happening. As I kind of started my remarks, I said it's a difficult administration to cover from the outside because of their communication and organizational strategy, and it really is both. But I would say I hope the communication with both allies, partners, and also adversaries in the region is really clear and really direct, even while their communication broadly to all the others who are listening is harder to absorb. So my hope is, especially if we are trying to change the behaviors of those in the region in a variety of ways, I hope we are being crystal clear in our communication. At least that then gives countries the chance to make the choices that they wish to make.
Anybody else? We don't have to go in order.
I would a timeline in place for transition to democracy, a plan on the table to re-democratize Venezuela and to perhaps hold elections in a situation where the economy is going to be more stable, where the security situation is going to be under control. This is a very complex process, involve a lot of diplomacy, but I think it would be an enormously positive step forward.
Communications, timeline, Klaus?
I would say don't disrupt the existing system without having a second and third plan for the crisis, and go a long-term way, not a short-term way. I think that is the lessons learned in Europe. Yeah, we believed in a totally open market, and we bitterly learned that this is not the case. And I think we have to make sure that everybody has a second and third plan for the crisis, and this is politically, and it's the security of supply and production and whatever.
Backup plan. Bill, piece of advice.
So, yeah, the solutions here are by definition long-term and focused. And the best thing that anyone can do is build towards stability, durability, because the investments, the revitalization of the energy business is going to take so much time. Those are the signals that everyone should be working towards. And the US government has a vital role in doing that, a lot of potential. And if we can build towards that, that's where the big win is.
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, I would just, like to commend our speakers for helping us understand this incredibly complicated situation better, and bringing us to a deeper awareness of all of the factors that are involved as we think about not only energy security, but also just the politics that are making that security feasible or possible. So fantastic comments, and thank you to our panelists. But I'd like to now open it up to the group and hear from you about questions you may have for any of our panelists, or questions that we haven't posed yet, the areas of discussion that you'd like to bring out. So I believe we have some microphones. Yeah. Anybody? Yes.
That assumes more or less that people are rational actors, but there's also been allusions to a very hardcore constituency in Venezuela with ties to the military, and no one has really addressed the possibility of sort of a militarized Venezuelan opposition to some of these inroads from the United States or some of these regional pressures. And I'd like to get a sense of the likelihood of that, the potential that has for basically upsetting the entire apple cart, because I don't think that's been touched on as much as I had hoped.
Or Peter, yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough question. Clearly, the United States, the Trump administration, did not want a military confrontation with Venezuela that would involve an occupation of the country or anything of the sort, which would be complex, difficult. Whether or not the Venezuelan military would be willing to bring on or to threaten that kind of a confrontation in order to carry out its, whatever plans it has to maintain itself in government is I think it's unlikely. But there are certainly hardcore elements who would probably say, bring it on, give us, if you want to invade us, go ahead. But I somehow don't think that most elements in Venezuela want to do that. There is no question that the United States has vast technical superiority over Venezuela in terms of its military capabilities. But it's a big country, and there are a lot of people, and there are a lot of guns, and no one wants to. Going there would be a very difficult situation in many ways, or complex situation all around. So I don't see it, but yes, there could be some in the Venezuelan military who harbor those kinds of ideas.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for hosting this event and participating. I'm Laura. I'm a Dartmouth 28. Right now I'm in an energy law and policy class with Professor Wilson. We've been discussing petroleum and how it's largely a key producer for the transportation aspect of the energy sector. With all this oil that Trump's administration is anticipating procuring from Venezuela, do you believe that his administration already has plans for this oil, or is it simply just to have the oil?
Bill, do you have any insight into that?
No, unfortunately, I wouldn't. Does anyone in the audience? Well, that's why we're here, right? If all the answers were out there, we wouldn't have to come.
What are the plans?
I mean, I guess what I would say is I can, and I think Bill and Klaus both kind of talked about this a little bit in their remarks. There is a pretty traditional way that the United States government, separate from the people, that the United States government has thought about this amorphous thing called energy security. And it's been, I don't know, it's been pretty consistent-ish, I think, since maybe roughly the Iranian Revolution. So that's a long time now. So from the end of the 70s, early 80s. And there was maybe the slightly less controversial and more controversial. The less controversial was a belief, I think, that we had an interest in there being enough production in the world that prices were at a level that we thought was going to foster good economic growth, and that part wasn't so controversial. The more controversial one was basically since at least the Iranian Revolution and maybe beforehand, there was the idea that we wanted to have close partners who controlled oil producers who we could go to in times of crisis and ask to vastly increase production in a short period of time. For example, Iraq invades Kuwait in 1990, and within weeks, I think this, maybe somebody on the panel I would guess the Saudis increased production by between 3 and 5 million barrels a day to compensate for the lack of Iraqi and Kuwaiti oil in world markets. Or the 9/11 attacks happen, and within a very short period of time, ironically, US partners in the Persian Gulf increased production rather quickly to try to stabilize markets. And so from a US national security standpoint, there is both a desire to make sure that there is flow, especially in crisis and wars, and that we have friends who we can call and say, we need you to substantially increase in the short term. And so that's what I assume is the overall strategic purpose. Whether or not there are additional deals with companies who are close to the administration, I have no insight into that. But I'd just say that's the traditional way the United States has thought about oil security, so to speak, over the past 30 or 40 years. Subject to be, corrected or amplified by
I would just say one other dynamic that's changed from when you think back to the days around the Gulf Wars and things like that, is the U.S. is a net crude exporter now. So there's a lot of coming in and out because we import crude from Canada that is refined on the Gulf Coast because we have the refinery set up for that. But on a net basis, we're a net energy exporter, big time in LNG. That's a new industry for the U.S. and even in the crude thing. So the idea of our energy security, we're probably in a very different situation than we were decades ago. But those fundamentals in the back of everyone's head is, hey, if things do get in a pinch, are there others that'll jump in? The spare capacity in OPEC is with Saudi Arabia and the UAE today. Those are relatively on-side countries who have stepped in the past, as you noted.
But this brings me to the question, the friends, how will they react? So we have a sleeping giant, Venezuela. It's a sleeping giant in oil production. It's a conflict to Saudi Arabia and the other big 4 oil producers in the world if this giant will awake. So I think they will react. They will react in the prices, what you said. Saudi Arabia can double the daily production very soon. And will they really sit there and be calm and wait what happens with a Venezuelan big production? Or will they say, okay, we keep it a bit lower during a price policy by increasing the other OPEC production? I'm not sure about it. And therefore, those friends are also friends to avoid that other friends can arise. So it's not such easy. And talking about military, we all should have in mind where Chavez came from. An officer in the military issue.
Couple more. Can we go to a student first and then another comment?
Hello, this is a 2-part question to Professor Press. I guess the first part is, why is the IADS systems in Venezuela, including the S-300 and 400, so ineffective and totally paralyzed in operation? And the second part would be, would special force operations to kidnap or to capture the VIP be the new normal of U.S. overseas intervention, or would that only be limited to the Western Hemisphere because of the countries are smaller, the force are weaker, and so on?
Could you say the second thing again, Shuning?
Yeah, would the special force operation to capture foreign VIPs be the new normal of U.S. foreign intervention? given, or would that only be a peculiar factor in the Western Hemisphere?
So I'll just say, Shuaning, as you could tell, is a student in my military analysis class. And so he dove right into, let's talk about air defense systems. But let me guess that the people who came to a talk on foreign policy and the Western don't want, although Shuaning and I would like to talk about air defense systems, we won't do that right now in front of you guys. And Shuaning, I'll talk to you after this about air defense systems. The slightly more broad question that he asked was about, I think if I understood it correctly, was about should we see this also as a model for the way the United States might use force in the future? And there I have to say, on that, the hair on the back of my neck goes up for a different reason than maybe the rest of you, which is I think, to my mind, this was a very dangerous, very risky thing that could have drawn us into the kind of war which Peter said we have no appetite for. We, the United States, have no appetite for at all. And so I would severely hope that the Trump administration sees that as a one-off, because the mission of kidnapping a sitting president in a foreign country protected by a variety of security apparatus, again, putting aside the legal and putting aside the normative thing, is a mission which if you do it 10 times, my guess is between 3 and 6 of them end up in one form of utter disaster after another. So I would hope that this is not something that we see tried too many other times. But I don't know.
Good question. Sir.
Hi, I think this is a question for Bill. So you had mentioned firms that, oil companies that have stayed in Venezuela, including Chevron, and they made some sacrifices, for lack of a better term, to do that. And you mentioned that they've got some short-term advantages by doing that. I think a question for you is, do they have long-term built-in advantages that would potentially benefit them or preclude other companies from coming in? And what would need to change to get broader investment in the region from their competitors?
Yeah, I think you look at the size of the potential opportunity. They were talking about 375 miles of heavy oil and lots of places to add value in the needs and potential of production for Venezuela. And there's probably room for everybody to find potentially attractive opportunities if all those other features that I mentioned when I addressed this initially can be moved into the right zone. So I don't think it gives them a special, long-term inside track, but certainly from the short term, being comfortable with working in an ambiguous and potentially challenging circumstance, they've got it. They've, were exporting, then they weren't, and then back in and out, and obviously it was making the news. They've got a muscle memory that's recent for dealing with that, so I would give them that short-term one. But I think in the long term, the size of the resource and the skill of the companies that are also looking at it, that have worked in Venezuela and other places, there's going to be enough for lots of potential.
Jeff.
Yeah, hi, this is it's for the panel, and so first of all, thank you all. This has been fascinating, and it gets to how domestic or other companies ought to think about bringing on a new source of competition. So you mentioned, sort of how OPEC players might think about it, but how would you think about it in West Texas, given that you may bring on 1 million, 2 million barrels a day, backed by U.S. loan guarantees, that will then depress prices, and will there be sort of domestic political opposition, not to mention sort of foreign competition?
That was I tried to explain in my presentation, that the price or the cost level for the production in Venezuela will be more or less in the range of the new investment production in US. And I think the US production is so important for the security of supply of all the things that it's very, very difficult to create a competitor to this. And money is very liquid. Money flows in this direction where it's best return on it. And that is much easier than with state-guaranteed loans in Venezuela and not state-guaranteed money in US. That is the difficulty we have and we have to solve. And I assume that most of the big companies, and Bill, please correct me, but as I know the big companies, they will step into Venezuela and claim things and then not investing anymore. But there will be a first step to be in the country, to have this part of the market, and then they will wait what happens with the government, what is the reaction of the public, and so on and so on. But everybody has to step in, otherwise he loses opportunities in the future. And that is the normal behavior of companies, to say, okay, we have to step in, but then we be careful with more further investments. We need some type of guarantee, and those guarantee will be in conflict with indigenous production in US. It's taxpayers' money.
One more quick question.
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Natalie. Thank you. Hi, my name's Natalie DeSarbo. I'm a master's in engineering focused on energy student here. This presentation has been very helpful for me to understand the long-term implications of what this could be and sort of the justifications for why this is happening. I'm curious why Trump captured Maduro now, why this wasn't done 5 years ago or 5 years in the future.
Question.
Good question.
Peter?
Well, I'll give it a try. The Trump administration in 2019 played what I thought would be, almost a definitive card in terms of sanctions on Venezuela, when it basically severed the ties between Venezuelan oil and the United States. That was, for Venezuela, a key issue. It had to redeploy its oil past the Citgo refineries, the Citgo distribution. Everything had been in place for Venezuela for a long time, for Venezuelan oil, through a commodity chain direct to the United States. That was extremely disruptive, and clearly the U.S. could do it because it really didn't need the Venezuelan oil at that point, and it could get by without it.
Why now?
Pardon?
Why now?
Why now? Everything else has failed. All the other sanctions had failed. The administration had put down different markers on all kinds of stuff. It was a sort of a step-by-step ramping up of the pressure on Venezuela, but clearly a decision had been made because the planning for this operation appears to have been something that had been going on for many months. This wasn't put together at the last minute in terms of going in and taking Maduro and removing him. That plan seemed to have been in place, but the issues of the drug trafficking, of the naming Venezuelan groups as Venezuelan linked organizations, the Tren de Aragua and the Cartel de los Soles, which is no cartel, but naming them as foreign terrorist organizations, all this other pressure, sort of on a step-by-step basis, nothing happens. And then you put yourself in the situation once you've moved all of these military assets in place where something has to give. And I think this was in the cards from a long time back.
Can I add one thought to that? Yeah, short one is to say, again, agreeing with everything that Peter just said, back to this other idea, which is it's become a cliche in Washington now to say the age of great power competition is now upon us. I think that was a clever thing to say 3 years ago. And what I think most of us heard when we heard that sentence was that there's going to be greater competition in the zones of the world where great powers are operating. What we didn't hear as clearly as we should is a reversion to this other behavior of the Cold War, which was more unilateral, more intense, maybe more frequent interventions of various sorts into the developing world. And so if we're right that we're back in, for the time being, an era of revitalized great power conflict, what we should expect is to see a reversion to some of the nasty bullying behavior that we saw that was part of the last time that we were in such a conflict.
Thank you so much. Big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all, and if you have further questions, I'm sure anybody would love to talk to you. Thanks, Bill, for joining us online, and see you soon.
Thank you.